Germans have read it. How was Adolf Hitler taught in your school? In general, you come back to Second World War and the Holocaust several times during school. I read Anne Frank's diary in religion class in, I think, 7th grade. Hitler's rise to power and the Holocaust usually are taught in 8th, 9th, and again in 12th grade. However, you might analyze some speeches or the political system during other classes than history too. Since some pointed out that this is only the way that it was taught, here's the explanation of what we were taught. During early years you learn how evil Hitler and the Nazis were. How many people died because of them and what the Holocaust was. Then you might learn what that meant on an individual level for Jews. Anne Frank's diary. As you go further you learn how the Nazis came to power, why Germans voted for them, and how the propaganda worked. Finally, you start to analyze the conditions that made regular people become mass murderers or fanatical soldiers of the Third Reich. As you can see, you start with a clear black-white image, then learn why they came into power, and finally question yourself if you could have been one of those people and how to prevent such a thing from ever happening again. Alongside this, you might visit a concentration camp. I myself visited Buchenwald and Hadamar, a euthanasia site, in which, for example, disabled people were killed. Alongside this, you might analyze speeches, art, or songs of that period in different classes. This was my experience. I went to school in a couple of different South German cities, Munich, Heidelberg, and Stuttgart. Starting in 8th grade onwards, we really seemed to focus on the Industrial Revolution and after. The last quarter of the school year was always focused on Second World War with some pretty short. Oh yeah, then we were split into 2 countries and that was bad. Reunification happened in the 90s. The older we got, the more detailed it tended to become. One of my graduation topics in German literature was exile poetry. There were at least 2 excursions to concentration camps built into the curriculum Dachau in grade 8 or 9, and then Auschwitz, Birkenau during our senior trip. I went on neither trip because I realized pretty quickly I didn't want to be around a bunch of middle schoolers who only knew one Jewish person, me, in a concentration camp. The second one happened during Yom Kippur, which seemed oddly fitting. When I went training for a couple weeks in Vilseck, I took a Saturday to visit Dachau. The impression that I got is that the Germans took extreme care to preserve the history and provide all the facts regarding the camp. It was very somber and emotional at some points. I felt like Germans are eternally apologetic regarding the Holocaust. They are eternally apologetic, at least the adults are. They culturally do a lot of things right, a lot of money and time and care gets sunk into monuments and education. It was just that I happened to live in a place and time where we were beginning to lose a lot of survivors, and it was just far enough in the past that people had become complacent. Jew was used as a slur in my age group a ton and I was treated like a novelty at best. I had a huge fight with school administration over the fact they called my Chanukah a fire hazard but were lighting Advent wreaths without supervision. It sucked and overshadowed a lot of good things for me, and it made watching the many Second World War and survivor documentaries that much more painful at the time. Your comment just gave me a thought. What was the life like for children of Nazi officials post-Second World War? Some of the children must have been indoctrinated, but many more others must not have been, and likely grew up rejecting their parents' ideologies. I wonder if you could share what you know. Look into the RAF specifically and generally how the Allies kept most of the Nazi officials in place after the war to keep the state running. Post-war Germany was a pretty good reality check, and the overwhelming majority was relieved the Nazi regime was destroyed. Some people kept the ideology alive behind closed doors, but not as many as you'd think. Most people tried to just survive and truly felt liberated. Confrontation between the generations was mainly about people that weren't brought to justice and remained in positions of power. I asked my parents-in-law about it. They are German and were the generation after the Nazi regime. They lived in small villages, so everybody knew each other. They said most people, who were heavily involved with the regime, were bad-mouthed a lot. It was like nobody in the whole villages and the neighboring villages wanted to talk to them or do something with them. They were the outsiders of the villages. I then asked, if everybody knew they were our Nazis, why did nobody arrest them? And basically everybody in question would just say they just followed orders or they had to do those things. And it was, like you would imagine, very difficult to differentiate between the people who said the truth and the ones who just wanted to save themselves. All in all, the generation of my parents-in-law very much resented the generation who lived during the Nazi regime. It was like, why, how did you let it happen? From my own personal experience, that would depend on part on how indoctrinated the official was to begin with. My grandfather was a civilian official during the Nazi regime, but although I never met him, all family accounts are that it was merely a deeply unfortunate marriage of convenience, and he was never more than ambivalent toward the ideology. He continued in the public service in West Germany after the war. My father, who was born before the war and went to elementary school under the Nazi regime, moved to Canada in his 20s and now has political opinions totally in line with other Canadians his age. The same goes for all of his siblings, including the one who still lives in Germany. Well, we first got taught about the First World War and then went into how Hitler started. As a small boy, how he got into politics, etc. Then Second World War and the Holocaust. After that we went to concentration camp near Berlin. It was truly heartbreaking walking around there and seeing everything. Seeing the gas chambers, the beds, the clothes, and the numbers they were given instead of their names. We even met someone who survived the Konzentrationslager. I can't even imagine what he went through. That sounds very rough to go through a Konzentrationslager. We never had a chance to do that. But we went to Bunker Valentin next to Bremen, where a factory for submarines was planned. Also the prisoner camp called Sandbostel, where the workers was holed under pretty bad circumstances, especially the Russian ones. We heard stories about their food were made out of wood shavings. That sounds very rough to go through a Konzentrationslager. I am German and went to Dachau on a school trip. It is so massive and insane that it did not really affect me deeply. I know about the horror from school and the many books that deal with the subject from various angles, but the horror itself is so unfathomable, so beyond normal human comprehension, that my brain treats it like something abstract, almost fictional. I guess it is the same reason why watching one person die is horrible, but hearing about thousands of civilians dying is just news. I felt the exact same way going through Dachau until the end. I went through it all, and it's hard to comprehend the scale of it. And then you walk back to the crematorium in the back part of the camp, and that's where I kinda just felt so much anxiety about it all, and it feels so much more real. When we were standing outside of the crematorium, I thought, wait, what did they do with the ashes of thousands of people? Surely that's a lot of ashes. Then we walked through the garden next to it, and there is a sign that says something like, "Here lie thousands of prisoners who died," and you realize they just probably mass dumped the ashes into a hole right here at your feet. It's gut-wrenching, but you're so right. It's hard to even think on that scale. I visited Munich and took a day trip to Dachau. Standing in the gas chamber was weird. I always pictured them bigger, and seeing the fucking ovens. Jesus, it was so juxtaposed because all around the camp is green forest and woods. Even the part where the crematorium is, you have to walk over that little bridge and idyllic stream. I remember looking down and seeing all the coins in the stream bed. Just thinking of all the poor people. I did like seeing the rocks on top of the monument from all the Jews that had visited. Kinda like a silent fuck you to the Nazis. I did like seeing the rocks on top of the monument from all the Jews that had visited. Kinda like a silent fuck you to the Nazis. This is a tradition that Jews do when visiting Jewish friends and families who have died. They don't do flowers usually. You put a rock on the grave. A rock is symbolic as preserving memories and legacy, whereas flowers wilt and die. Have you ever been in Auschwitz? For God's sake, they were making rope out of human hair. In Birkenau they have books on display bound in human leather, together with the double saw to cut slices, human lampshade, all in a display cabinet of the doctor's office that's just beyond the basements with the meat hooks on rails on the ceiling. The clinical display of horror was intense. I thought it was very interesting hearing about how some Allied commanders would take Germans from the villages nearby some of the death camps and take them to the death camps. Ronald Reagan, in his autobiography, said for his post in the armed forces, he reviewed a lot of this footage before it was released to the public. He said they'd start out with Germans, seemingly like it would be a field trip, like they were going to this place they knew was nearby and was just a camp for prisoners of war and such, oftentimes smiling and in good cheer. As they were led through the camps, he said you could see the men's faces become ashen and grim and the women crying. Later on afterward, he talked about he'd have guests and some would occasionally say something like, "You know, I wonder if all that stuff really happened." He said he'd often make it a point to take out some of the films he had kept after the war and show to these guests. The mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife were brought into the camp after it was liberated. They committed suicide that night, all allegedly leaving a note saying, "We didn't know, but we knew." I'm not German, in fact, I'm Japanese. I lived and worked in Germany in the 1950. The country was still in its rebuilding stages, and the evidences of the horrible carnage the country suffered was all over. I became good friends with a few Germans who lived in the same neighborhood I did. They became friendly with me upon learning that I was of Japanese descent, and they sort of looked at me as an ally of theirs. We talked about the war and Hitler, and a couple of my friends were quite open with me, extolling the good that Hitler had done for Germany. After First World War, Germany was in pretty bad shape. They told me about how Hitler came upon the scene and he rebuilt the country and brought pride to the people of their new prosperity. To a man they denounced the treatment of the Jews, but a few of them repeated some of the old suspicions of the Jewish people that Germans held before and during the war. Upon their asking, I related to them how my relatives in Japan were taken in by the nationalistic rhetoric of the times there, but now regretted their country's turn to its militarism. Like the Germans who told of how the country was brought up from its poverty after First World War to its new prosperity, my relatives related how life improved for them with the new regime that, unfortunately, led them to Second World War and their new misery. Both my German friends and my relatives in Japan were taken in by their leaders and never envisioned the horror of the events that followed. My grandparents are Austrian, and the Holocaust absolutely breaks their hearts because they really truly believed Hitler was turning things around. The propaganda was very real. In my case, it was taught severally, not just in history class but also in ethics class or philosophy. Also not just in 1 year, more over all my secondary school time since 5th grade to through 13th grade. In history we learned about the political structures that led to First World War and therefore to Second World War. In philosophy we discussed about how we think we would behave in such a regime. In ethics we watched movies like Clockwork Orange or The Experiment. My school also had a trip to Dachau. It was awful to say at least, but I think it's important for every German to go to a Konzentrationslager at least once. There is no law or something like that, but most schools I know of do a trip with their older pupils. Also not school in particular, but on our TV history channels N24. NTV do a lot, and I mean a lot, of Second World War documentaries. In every major city I know of are a lot of museums, memorials of shame, I guess, and memorials for couraged people like Die Weiss Rose, the White Rose who fought against the regime. There are daily reminders who are important, especially because we have a newish racist party who gains more and more power. That's really scary, like the people learn nothing. I think most of the schools in Germany really do a good job teaching us about the history of our country. I mean, there is a reason Germans are not really proud to be German, although nowadays we can. Of course, we learned about concentration camps and all of the other horrible things. Our teacher made it very visual with pictures and recordings of speeches. It really stuck with me. It was very upsetting and maybe sometime a lot to drop on young kids. But what I found very important is that we learned a lot about how he even got the power and what little things went wrong in the very beginning, and we tried to make connections to things happening today all around the world. It made all of us very aware of those details and problems, and me and my friends often talk about it. So although Germany has such a bad history, we try not to forget it, and school constantly confronts the students. I mean, it is probably not like that everywhere, but it should. Does it scare you that there are some neo-Nazi groups in Germany at this point? To be honest, no. There were always high-ranking Nazis in public office, even after 1945. The United States needed them in the formation of new secret services or as judges and police. There were always subtle remains of Nazism in German society. Some of our laws didn't change after 1945. Some views in society stayed the same. There's always a potential for a party or movement to cash in those about 20% people wanting back Hitler or a nationalistic Germany. The bigger problem is the blindness of the secret services and police for right-wing terrorism. Very insightful and a little sad. I've met so many nice and amazing Germans. I think you all should be proud of your country. I'm from the United States, and all countries have horrific pasts. The United States has slavery, the Trail of Tears, to name only a few. Question: how was the United States' interference in Second World War taught? Negatively. We're not sad or anything just because we're not proud of our country. We're proud of the things we as persons have done. Might as well be proud of a mountain if I am proud of my sea country. No reason to be proud of that. And no, the interference of all the Allies was of course taught positively. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics may be less because of the German Democratic Republic, but still those nations freed Germany and Europe from the Nazis. The United States bombing of Japan is taught negatively, understandably. United States tried to remain neutral while selling munitions to Britain. Didn't contribute nearly the deaths that Russia did, but we United States of America like to think that we are the reason we aren't all speaking German now. Nuclear weapons is a big one, but to be fair, Japan was not going to give up unless we made a show of power. I am from Austria, and I was told how he became powerful and what he did in order to get there and so on. Well, most of the things you need to know about the topic. But as I visited Hartheim, I got told a bit more. Hartheim was the location of a concentration camp for disabled people, and my mother knew someone from there, and he told us a lot of things they don't tell you in school. The Nazis made a lot of scientific discoveries as they tried to create the Aryan race. Basically the wanted tall, handsome people with white skin and blue eyes, and they did a lot in order to get there. One of those things I got told was that they knew about the fact that if a woman is pregnant with twins and the blood of one baby gets into the eye of the other while they are in the womb, it could cause a change of eye color from brown to blue. So they made tests on living twin children where they took blood from one and ingested it into the eye of the other with a syringe. Another thing I heard was that especially in Hartheim, where they had a lot of disabled people, they did not see them as living things, so they made practical use of their bodies after those experiments. So they made bags and lampshades out of the skin. Today there is a hospital especially for disabled people in Hartheim, and one of the patients is an artist my mum knew from her childhood. He is painting pictures with his feet and mouth because he can't move his hands. Those are some pretty weird paintings. I try to find them. I actually wasn't taught a lot about Hitler now that I think about it. I was taught more in general how the Nazis rose to power, which of course also went into Hitler. My main problem with answering the question is that I also watched an ass ton of documentaries at the same time, so I can't exactly tell you what I have from school and what I have from documentaries. I believe the main part one had about Hitler was on some types of political campaigning he did. Flying to different towns by plane to campaign, which was unheard of back then, and so on. Also that he took acting classes to train his speeches and erratic movements during his speeches. I'm an American. When I lived in London, I invited an 18-year-old exchange student from Trier, Germany, to come visit me. She had been an exchange student who lived with my family for a year in the United States. She spent her first day in London wandering around, just looking and appreciating. When we met at my flat for dinner, I asked her what she thought. She replied, "It's such a beautiful city. But there are so many blocks with ugly new buildings right next to beautiful old buildings. Why did they do that?" It emerged that despite a very upscale education in the gymnasium system in Germany, at 18 years old she knew nothing of the Blitz. She had only been taught of the bombings in her own country. Simply defies belief. Well, while the Blitz was a horrible experience, the bombings of cities were sadly very common on both sides. In Germany, the focus lays much more on the Holocaust and the war crimes. During my history class, we nearly never talked about the military side of Second World War, so not about the Blitz neither. The focus were always how the National Socialist German Workers' Party German came to power, and how Germany did war crimes in Eastern Europe and crimes against humanity against Jews, Roma, and the other minorities. That's because schools mostly focus on the rise to power and what mechanism he used to go around the Constitution. One of them is very similar to the Patriot Act, by the way, and focus was on war crimes and the Holocaust. Regarding the actual war, there was a clear emphasis on who started it, the attack on Poland, the annex of Austria. We were taught how there were several fronts, though mostly about the eastern and western part. It was mentioned that there were air attacks on the United Kingdom and part was happening in Africa as well, but that wasn't the focus. So chances are that she knew that Germany bombed London, but didn't count 2 plus 2 together as the war wasn't really the focus point. Austrian here. Excuse any grammatical errors, spelling mistakes. We actually started with First World War and the aftermath, how Hitler was first struck down as his party was seen as too radical, and then were taught about his uprising, him becoming chancellor, and how the party gained power. We learned a lot about the Reichskristallnacht, the burning of books, and actually quite a lot about Hitler's upbringing, his granddad being possibly Jewish, and that, for example, Hitler was vegetarian and his dad was apparently very abusive. Our teacher made sure to make us understand every aspect possible of Hitler, and I can say that. Every now and then she struggled staying neutral. We did go to Mauthausen, watched films about Hitler's speeches, Mengel's experiments, the ghettos and camps, visited the gas chambers. Our teacher really didn't leave a single bit out, and this has really left its mark on all of us. We first got confronted with the Nazi regime and Holocaust in the 6th grade when we read Friedrich. German title, Damals War as Friedrich. In our German class, it's about 2 boys and their families growing up together during Hitler's rise. Friedrich's family is Jewish, and you see the continuous discriminating treatment of Jews through the eyes of a child. The following years we had Second World War, the Third Reich, Hitler as a topic in nearly every subject at some point. In religion we talked about the role of the church during the time. In German we analyzed poems, books or short stories from or about the time. In art lessons we analyzed paintings from that time. In geography we talked about how the war changed our cities and infrastructure, not only after the war but what infrastructure Hitler built to make the war production possible. Of course, history was the subject Hitler was discussed in the most. We talked about how it was possible to gain power like he did, failed Weimar Republic for example, and how he managed to build his dictatorship. We haven't talked about the war itself as much as one would maybe think. The focus was mainly on the Holocaust, propaganda, and what happened after the war. Apart from what everyone else said here, we're also getting shown videos and photos of the dead bodies, of the starving and crying people, people getting separated from their families, little girls getting their heads shaved and crying, mothers seeing her own child getting shot, and the dead victims getting thrown in a pit like if they were waste. We're reading poems written by people in the Konzentrationslager. If you're not mentally ill or some kind of psychopath, you're completely shocked and can't believe this did actually happen. We aren't forced to believe that Hitler was bad. We aren't taught that Hitler is bad. But these things they show us are for a healthy human being enough to understand how evil he was. He was not an evil person, he was some filthy demon from hell, and his fast death should have been slower and way more painful. I'm not religious, but I hope there is a hell only for him. I'm German, 29 years old, and can talk about how it was taught 15 years ago. To be frank, it's taught very neutral, at least in my Bundesland like states in America, but in a smaller way. Every Bundesland has its own school, education plan. He is not demonized or glorified, he is treated as a piece of our past we have to avoid. Beginning at the start First World War, how he lived as a person and his role in the war, his interests in politics and his rise to power, how his look on the world formed and why it was controversy and wrong. Also, our teacher was sure to take it with a grain of salt, since they burned many evidences and wrote them anew. After his rise, the school focused more on the historian links that lead to his near untapped power. The luck of surviving assassination attempt after assassination attempt by the German rebels. Yeah, many Germans didn't like where he was heading, but ultimately helped him in gaining total control. They focused hard not only on the Nazi regime, but also on the splinter groups and the Jews. How Hitler used the media and propaganda to blame everything on them to make the loyal Germans despise them. For example, shooting videos how good they live in a fake city only built to shoot the films. Them eating good and laughing while the Germans died on the battlefield. Like I said, our teacher was very neutral, pointing out what he did with most efficiency and skill to reach his goals. Until the war went south, since Hitler started to lose his mind since he could not comprehend defeat. So yeah, he is no villain or hero in our teaching. He is a mistake they want us never to forget without feeling guilty, since the generation after have nothing to do with the crimes of the past, even when sometimes the world would disagree. Well, mostly you get over the war dates and stuff in the 9th grade. Every German class is obligated to visit on concentration camp or euthanasia center for the disabled. I visited Hadamar. It was chilling to say the least. My history teacher was very observant, especially in lower grades, to maybe spot those with troubled home life and catch them before they go down on the wrong path. Later, in grade 10 to 12, we mostly tried to figure out and understand the twisted psychology that drives people to leaving their feelings of guilt and morale behind in order to commit such crimes. All in all, I would say we really went in depth more on the terror that was brought over both Germany and invaded countries more than the actual person Adolf Hitler. We only briefly touched on the Nuremberg processes and the consequences for the country. My grandma used to say, "We deserve no respect for rebuilding the country. We were the ones who let it happen in the first place. It was our duty." With all that said, I went to one of the higher education schools in the country, and I know that there are many that only very briefly touch on the topic at all, besides the obligatory concentration camp visit, and at that point many lack the knowledge to contextualize the importance of the place. I am half German, half Serbian. I grew up in Germany, and when I was 5-6 years we moved to Serbia. Here he is taught as though he was a supervillain, of course. He was, but history is a science, and although I think he was a bad person, everything in science should be taught objectively. When I visit friends or family in Germany, he is a taboo topic. It feels like they're ashamed. I think in general there is too much hatred directed towards Germany and Germans for that. I had a few cases in school in Serbia where some kids were bullying me and calling me names because of it. I was born there. And once I beat one of them up, 'cause I couldn't stand it anymore. It just got worse for the next months. Luckily that was 8 or 9 years ago. Now I don't have any problems with it. All my friends think it is great that I speak German and I help them with German homework. Got bullied for being German. People around the world feel a little hatred towards Germans, while they are ashamed for stuff that happened before their birth. Okay, so we do learn about Hitler and all the bad shit he did, but we also learned about how good of a public speaker he was and how amazing he was at controlling people's ideas. They drill into our minds the horrible past of the Nazis to make sure we don't forget. I was born in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. My grandmother moved here after the war, so she didn't live through the blockade, thankfully, but her parents did fight in Ukraine. In like 9th grade, on the anniversary of lifting the blockade, our literature teacher spent the whole hour telling us about the blockade from experience. I still remember vividly her sitting there, quietly speaking about the unimaginable horrors. She felt so frail, so distant from us in those memories. I feel so much respect and admiration for her for putting herself through recounting all that for our benefit. And then, afterwards, I heard my shitty classmates mocking her. Fuckers. Do read about the blockade of Leningrad if you're not familiar with it. It feels like it's not a well-known part of the war outside of Russia. We focused on the National Socialist German Workers' Party as a whole. Hitler was treated as just another high-ranking functionary like Goebbels, Göring, and Himmler. Funny enough, though, Stalin was the center topic of several periods. On the other hand, our history teacher at the time spent decades teaching in the German Democratic Republic before the reunification. Guess she has simply kept the old pattern and merely toned the glorification of the Soviet Union and its leaders down a bit. Thank you for watching this video to the end. And also be sure to subscribe to our channel to not miss new super interesting videos, and I advise you to watch our other videos.